Hello, welcome everyone. It is October 15th, 2025, and we are in ActInf GuestStream number 82.6, continuing with the Robert Worden series. Today, Robert will be presenting and we will discuss a unified theory of language part 1. So if you're watching live, please write any questions in the live chat and we'll address it after this presentation. So thank you, Robert, for joining. To you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, this is Robert Worden here talking about a unified theory of language. This is a summation of what I've been doing in language for several years now. And it's in a paper on arXiv, which you can go to. And it's quite a long paper. It's about 50 pages, actually. So this talk is in two parts. And I'll introduce what is coming in each part in a minute. Right, now. So the talk is really about all of language, and language is traditionally looked at in terms of these different areas. There's phonology, that's how sounds fit together to make words. There is syntax, there is how the words fit together to make utterances, statements and questions and so on. There is semantics, how utterances express meanings. There is pragmatics, and that is how we carry on conversations with each other, how we understand what each other is going on in conversation. And those are the four traditional areas. Then, of course, there is learning. How do we learn to do all of this stuff? And finally, there's evolution. How did language evolve and why did it evolve? And the two columns at the right, speaker and listener column, are empty, but they are there to remind us that in every question in language, there are two sides to the question. There's a speaker side, how do the speakers do it? And there's a listener side, how do listeners understand what's going on? And finally, the evolution row at the bottom. I believe this phrase, I don't know who said it, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the life of evolution. And certainly language, there's a lot to say about language evolution. And I shall be saying that in two parts in both these talks. So here's what I'm going to cover roughly in the first of the live streams. Language, I shall say, works by hierarchical Bayesian pattern matching. In other words, by minimizing free energy. So it's a ripe area for the FEP to be applied. It's quite a complicated area because it's not just pattern matching. Many thousands of different patterns are involved. We have one pattern for every word in our native language. And the state of the art now is there are working models of phonology, syntax, and semantics. The situation in pragmatics is not so clear. Anyway, these working models have been developed in cognitive linguistics, and I shall be taking an approach that uses cognitive linguistics, not Chomskyan linguistics. And in cognitive linguistics, every word is represented by what's called a construction. And a construction is a graph, a feature structure pattern. And what we do when we speak language or hear it is we do Bayesian pattern matching. And the particular word in cognitive linguistics for that pattern matching is unification. And that's been developed for a long time now, for a good 40 years, that idea has been in development. And we learn language by a different operation on feature structures, which is called intersection. And that's a kind of complement to unification, which I will talk about. So all of that is a model of language which works at David Marr's level 1 of requirement and level 2 of abstract algorithms and data structures. It's not a neural implementation. And I regard the neural implementation of language as a problem yet to be solved. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the first live stream, and pragmatics I'll leave entirely to the second. Now, just a brief summary of the second live stream, some kind of foretaste. It's all about evolution. Language started in conversation. That was the earliest evolution of language, simple conversations. And language evolved by sexual selection, not just natural selection. and that sexual selection to do a particular thing to show off our intelligence, and that's why we are so intelligent, actually. And because of this, language is not the neutral system that people think of. It's rather biased, and it's about social status. And in any conversation, we use special patterns for mind reading, for knowing what the other person's thinking about. So that's theory of mind. And then I shall be mainly talking about pragmatics. Pragmatics, I shall say, uses the same kind of Bayesian pattern matching as we saw in this live stream for syntax and semantics. This model of pragmatics addresses both the speaker side and the listener side of the problem. That is new. So we learn these mind reading patterns, and in those patterns, we have a thing called a shadow audience, which is our imagination of the other person who assesses our own status. And that idea of a shadow audience is the whole basis of the human sense of self. Now, the human sense of self is obviously very important because it's the basis of all human society. But I shall say it's the greatest affliction. It is a great deal of trouble for us as well. And I shall describe why it's trouble and affliction. And I shall finally talk a little about mindfulness, which is a release from this human self. So that was a foretaste of the second live stream, but enough of that. We'll go back to the first now. And we start with the first in evolution. So language evolution is a question of two parts, really. Part one is, what is the underlying cognitive capability? What's the mechanism in the brain that does it? And second, how did language actually evolve? In particular, one species and no other species. So this talk, first part, addresses only part one of the question. And the answer, very simply, is that language is hierarchical Bayesian pattern matching. That, as you know, is a capability that exists in all mammals. So hierarchical Bayesian pattern matching in animals is this sort of hierarchy. At bottom level, we have features of sense data, edges, sounds, and motion, and so on. Next level up, those features are integrated into parts of objects, things like limbs and leaves. Next level up, the brain classifies these into whole objects like food or animals or plants. And finally, at the very top level, we have the full generative model of three-dimensional space around the animal, which is the basis of consciousness. So that is what the hierarchy looks like in typical applications of the free energy principle on animal cognition. And there are many FEP models of this. And as you know, it's a joint top-down and bottom-up inference process, getting the two consistent with each other. And there are FEP neural implementations of that. So a lot of work in the FEP on that. Now, going on to language, this is how language has a similar hierarchy. The bottom level of the hierarchy, there are phonemes, parts of words, syllables, if you like. Next level up, those integrated into words. Next level up, those words are integrated into utterances. And finally, individual utterances are pulled together in conversations. So that's the hierarchy for language. And joining the levels of the hierarchy, we have the different topics in language. Phonology puts phonemes together to make words. Syntax and semantics put words together to make utterances. And finally, pragmatics is how utterances are put together to make conversations. Now, as I say, I think this is a very fertile area for the FEP. Are there any FEP models of this? Now, as far as I know, there aren't, because most of the work in the FEP on language has been in the Chomsky tradition rather than in a cognitive linguistics tradition, which is much more akin to this hierarchical pattern matching idea. It's quite hard to do. There are lots of patterns to be matched, but basically this is an FEP application. And I don't think it's been done yet in cognitive linguistics. There have been FEP papers on Chomsky linguistics, but those are different. Now, there is a long-running dispute or feud between Chomsky linguistics and so-called cognitive linguistics. Now, cognitive linguistics on the left has been developed since about 1975 or 80 by a large number of people, Gerald Gazdar, Kaplan, Ronald Langacker, and many others. And it uses unification-based grammars. It makes computational models. It has constructions which are feature structures, and each construction has two poles, which I shall go through all of this in some detail. And that is cognitive linguistics. On the other side, there is generative grammar, and there has been a long-running dispute, really, between workers in cognitive linguistics and followers of Chomsky. And generative grammar, you will recognize many of the memorable slogans of generative grammar. It started a long time ago with transformation, deep structure. It has this idea of poverty of the stimulus, that the learning stimulus for a child is not sufficient to support learning of language. So because the stimulus is inadequate, there has to be a lot of innate grammar in the mind. This is revealed by language universals, and there is a syntax module in the brain which has autonomy, which is a module on its own. It has nothing to do with other parts of the brain. And there's a Chomskyan distinction of language competence versus language performance. And the story of language evolution is quite a strange one. The Chomskyan story is that there was a kind of miracle mutation, that language arrived on one individual called Prometheus in one generation, about 200,000 years ago, by a miracle mutation, a hugely unlikely mutation. So that, if you like, is Chomskyan linguistics in a nutshell. There's been loads of ideas throughout the years. Now, I believe that cognitive linguistics has been much more successful than Chomskyan linguistics for two reasons. It's built much more working computational models, and they really do work for many different languages, and it's confronted much more empirical data about language, whereas Chomskyan linguistics, they haven't built very many working models, and many of the core hypotheses have been shown to be incorrect. In other words, just go through those in a bit of detail. Transformations, deep transformations, are no longer believed in. The idea of the poverty of the stimulus is discredited. There is plenty of stimulus for a child to learn language. So language universals turn out not to be universal. There are always exceptions. There is no autonomy of syntax. Syntax is irrevocably mixed up with semantics, if you like. There is no actual competence versus performance distinction. Performance was a kind of convenient way of being able to ignore a lot of the data, if you like. And there is no idea of a miracle mutation needed to account for language. So I shall be firmly on the side of cognitive linguistics, and I shall be advocating that work in the FEP should take that approach to language. So what is cognitive linguistics? It's also called construction grammars. And this has been a successful model of language since about 1980. And in this model, every word is represented by what's called a construction. And there are larger constructions for phrases as well as words. But each construction is, at a logical level, a directed acyclic graph, a DAG. And every construction has both a phonetic pole, has two poles. A phonetic pole, which consists of the sounds, at least of the sounds of a word, and a semantic pole, which consists of the meaning of the word. So that's what constructions are. You combine these constructions in a sentence by unifying them. So unification is the key operation. And that operation handles both speech production and speech comprehension. In other words, it does both sides of the problem, the speaker's problem and the listener's problem. And this approach handles phonology, syntax, and semantics. So what I'm going to be talking about in this part of the live stream is really work that has evolved over the past 40 or 50 years. There's very little that's actually new here. It's just so. One of the things I shall refer to is I've made an online model of how cognitive linguistics handles pragmatic phonology, syntax, and semantics. And the model is available here at bayeslanguage.org. So I would urge you to go and look at that demonstration to see the things I'm talking about actually demonstrated in many different examples. And this online model does production and understanding of sentences for a number of simple concrete sentences up to half a dozen words each. And so what this model does is it converts between meanings and words in both directions. Speakers go from meanings to words and listeners go from words to meaning. And the way it does it is it does one unification for each word in the sentence, and you can see the unification happening. It has about 100 words in it, and you can use those words to make up your own sentences and see what it makes of them. And it's also a model of learning. It can learn these words from scratch, starting with no language model. So I shall be referring to this model and using diagrams from it when I talk. Right. So here's a construction, a typical construction in construction grammars. It's a construction for the word girl. And it's a feature structure, it's a graph. As you can see, it's a tree graph in this case. And it's got various type nodes. And the phonetic pole is just the sound of the word, sound girl. And it's actually broken up into phonemes, G, G, Earl, but that's not expanded. And the semantic pole is the meaning of the word girl. And the meaning of the word girl is a person, one person, and it's young and it's female. So that is a typical example of a construction in construction grammars. Nouns are the simplest constructions because the phonetic pole consists of a noun, consists only of the sounds. It's pure phonetics. Now, if we go to the next more complex thing for a verb like drinks, here you find the phonetic pole is more complicated. The phonetic pole has the sound drinks in the middle. It also has two other things. It has a subject, the person doing the drinking, and an object, the thing being drunk. And it needs both those things to make sense. So the phonetic pole in this is more complicated, and the semantic pole is a scene in which a person is doing some drinking of a thing. And these curvy lines are links which make the construction into not a tree, a directed acyclic graph. And I've pulled them apart in order to pull apart the phonetic pole from the semantic pole. But in a sense, they share some nodes. And what these curvy links do is they move meaning. And when a listener is listening to a sentence and they unify the sound drink, the meaning of the subject must be there. The meaning of the agent, the person doing the drinking, has to be there in advance. And it moves that person from there down into the final meaning scene. Similarly, the thing being drunk has to be there as well. The curved link moves the meaning down into the drinking scene. So that is the phonetic pole and semantic pole for a more complicated kind of word construction. In fact, all word constructions have this pattern with several links, 0 or more links across between the phonetic pole and the semantic pole. So how do we speak and understand language in this model? This is the most complicated slide in the talk, and it illustrates how we understand a simple sentence, a two-word sentence, in this case, doggy runs. And the starting point is top middle, and you can see the listener listening to this sentence, doggy runs, starts off with only the sounds, and there the phonemes doggy runs are listed vertically. And what the listener first does is he unifies this the listener has a number of constructions in her mind, and she has a construction for the word doggy, and that consists of the phonemes doggy and the meaning, which is a thing of type dog. And what the listener does is to unify this word doggy with the initial sound. And the result of that unification is here. What's happened is that the matching parts, the doggy part has matched between here and here. So they've been shaded out because they matched. And the meaning of the word doggy has been imported in here. And the remaining parts of the sentence are unchanged. So that is the result of the first unification. And you can see what's happened. Unification is always a growing of patterns. It always makes patterns bigger. So that's the first step of unification. And that result of step one is pulled down here to the middle of the bottom. And the next step of unification is to take the word for runs, the construction for run, and this has a complicated phonetic pole with both the thing running, the top, and then the sound runs, and then a semantic pole here. And now we unify these two together, and we match up on the sounds, runs, and runs. So what we get now is all the sounds have been matched up and are grayed out. But what was produced is the bottom here, the bottom meaning scene in which it is a running act, and the thing that doing the running is a dog. So the listener has understood what the speaker said. Now, that's a unification model of understanding. There's a very similar unification model of language production. And in production, you've seen in understanding, you always match up the sounds, they match the phonetic poles, and you add the semantic poles. In production, you go the other way around. You match up the semantic poles and you add the sound poles. And so you start with just a meaning and you end up with a whole load of sounds that you can express, you can say. And so the order of unification has to be reversed there, that you start with the verbs when you're producing, and then you end up with the nouns. And again, unification is a way of growing the structure so that you grow from pure meaning to a meaning and a sound. And in this case, the curvy links move the meaning upwards. Okay, so that is the construction grammar, cognitive linguistics model of how we speak sentences, how we understand them. And as I said, you can see them in the demonstration where I've given you the link. Finally, no, I'm switched now. So how does this relate to the FEP? It relates because the operation of unification, which has been around in cognitive linguistics for 40 or 50 years, that is a Bayesian pattern match. In other words, it's a minimization of free energy. And I'll explain briefly why that is. The construction graph for a word has a certain information content, and the information I is the sum of the information in all its nodes and slots. So you can go round the graph looking at the information in all the nodes and slots and add it up, and that simply is the information content. But it also represents some situation in the world, and the probability of that situation is 2 to the minus I. Obviously, the more information, the more improbable the situation is. Now, when you unify two constructions, A and B, that's written C equals AUB. And how do you form C? To form C, you, as we've just seen, you match up A and B wherever possible, wherever they have the same slots and values. And you're not allowed to have any conflicts when you match up. So you keep the matching, in the unification C, you keep the matching parts, and you keep both non-matching parts from A and B. And that's why unification is a growing operation. And the result of this is that C, the result C, contains A, and it also contains B. And C is the smallest graph which has this property. In other words, of all the graphs which do this, C has the smallest possible information content. So it has the largest possible probability, 2 to the minus I. So it's the Bayesian maximum likelihood match of A and B. Equivalently, it's the minimum free energy matching of A and B. So Unification is just a free energy minimization process. Right, now the demonstration which I've told you about also does language learning. I'll talk briefly about how that works. There's another operation you can know on two constructions, and it's called intersection. And you write the intersection by this funny upside down U. D is A, U, B. Now, how do you form D? Again, you match up A and B wherever possible. Now, you keep the matching part and you ignore any non-matching parts. In other words, any slots in A and B that are different, you just forget those slots. So the result of that is that the structure A contains B and the structure B contains D. But D is the largest possible feature structure which has this property, which is contained by both A and B. So D has the largest possible information content. And that's the intersection operation. Intersection is essential for learning. The reason it's essential is that what intersection does is it projects out the common parts of two states of affairs and it throws away the rest. And that's what you need to do in learning. Language learning is a whole lot of individual sentences, situations you hear, and you have to project out what's common between those in order to learn. And I'll just briefly describe how that happens. Bootstrap learning by intersection. Suppose a young child has learnt some words already, A, B, and C, but hasn't learnt some new word X. So she hears a sentence which contains the words A, B, and X. That means she can do part of the understanding process, unifying A and B, but she can't unify X. So she does what part of the understanding process she can do, producing a large feature structure. And she can also observe what's going on. She can infer the whole meaning from the conversational context, from what an adult is making a gesture or there's some food on the table or whatever it may be. She can guess the meaning. On a reasonable proportion of those occasions, she gets the guess right. So she puts the partially understood sentence together with the guessed meaning to produce what I call a learning example. And this is denoted by L1. And she collects a small number of these learning examples, L1, L2, L3, all with different A's and B's, but all of them having the same unknown word X in them. Then, in her mind, she can do the features unconsciously, of course. She can do the intersection operation between these feature structures, L1 intersect L2, intersect L3. And now what turns out, and you can show this mathematically, is that the intersection is just the construction for the new word. In other words, that intersection is the construction feature structure for X. So she learned a new word, and that way she can bootstrap actually from no words at all, learning nouns first, as children do, to learning a full vocabulary and full speaking ability. So you can see how this works from the demonstration, which here is the URL for the demonstration again. So what this shows is that the Chomskyan idea of poverty of the stimulus, the idea that there's not enough information to learn from, is just a myth. Right, I think I'm getting fairly close to the end now. This model of language, the cognitive linguistics model, is a model at Mars level 2. It's an abstract set of algorithms and data structures. The abstract data structures are the feature structures, of course, but it's not a neural implementation. It uses hierarchical Bayesian pattern matching, but there is no neural implementation of it yet, as far as I know. Now, I think one could implement this in the FEP and one could start on neural implementation of it. And I think that's a very important problem to try. I would dearly love to collaborate with anybody in doing that. I think there are a number of challenges in it. And here are the challenges. That there are thousands of word patterns to be matched, not just a few patterns, thousands. So you have to rapidly, selectively retrieve a few possible patterns to see which ones match best. You're always looking for the best fit. So there's some fast selective retrieval needed. And if you get to the unification operation, it involves a discrete search space as well as a continuous search space. So ordinary gradient descent is probably going to be a rather inefficient way to do it. I don't know what is the efficient way to do that unification. And finally, the graphs that you use here are dynamic ones. Feature structures are dynamic, tree structures, graph structures. How do you model those by static neural networks? Now, I just don't know the answers to those questions, but I would very much appreciate it if anybody wanted to collaborate on trying to produce an FEP implementation of language in this way. So I say, I don't think it's been done yet because I think most of the FEP work on language has been in the Chomsky tradition rather than the cognitive linguistics tradition. So that is actually the end of part one, which took less time than I thought. But so here's the summary of part one of this live stream. Language works by hierarchical Bayesian pattern matching. And there are many thousands of patterns. And in cognitive linguistics, this has led to working computational models of phonology, syntax, and semantics. And these are in lots of different languages. It's been done in lots of different languages. It covers up to semantic. It doesn't yet cover pragmatics. That is another subject for the next talk. So every word is a construction. It's a feature structure graph. It has two poles, a semantic pole and a phonetic pole. The key operation is unification, and unification is Bayesian pattern matching, or equivalently, it's the minimization of free energy. The same model can do learning by intersecting feature structures, but this is all at Mars level 2. The neural implementation of Mars level 3 is a problem still to be solved. I do invite anybody to collaborate on tackling that problem. So that's what I've covered so far, and pragmatics is the key gradient which will be addressed in the next live stream. So I've finished ahead of time, and also questions, I guess.
Thank you, Robert. Do you want to share the bayeslanguage.org demo?
Yeah, I could do that.
Yeah, that might help
now,
clarify.
Okay, let me go to it. Take a few minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Meanwhile, if anyone has questions, they can write it in the chat. So I will bring that on screen. Okay, go for it.
Okay, so here's the page you land on if you go to that, and the slide sets and papers there. But actually, to run the model, you do that, and that's what the model looks like. And you've got various menus at the top. There's a help menu, tells you how to get started and so on. And you can look at constructions for words. And there's a whole load of words. If you take G, right, take the word like him, and there you have the construction with its phonetic pole here. And as you hover over nodes, you get explanation of what's going on. So there you can look at words. And here you can look at a few sample sentences. You can make your own sentences, but I've got a few samples here. And there's the one, doggy runs. They're fragments of sentences. Like we have a complicated one here, girl who fell. And that's the meaning. That's girl who fell is the sound part of it. And the meaning part is a scene in which a thing, which is a girl, does an action, which is falling down. So what you can do with that sentence, if I can get it, is you can try understanding that sentence. let's see what I don't seem to have enough. Not sure. Yeah, I have to manipulate this a bit to get the buttons to show here. Right, if I want to understand this sentence, then we start with the whole sentence, girl who fell, and you can either expand or contract some of these. This is contracted, right? Girl who fell, and there's the word girl, which you unify first. So you ask it to do a step, and it does a step of unification, and that's the result. So you've removed or hidden the sound girl, and you left the sound who fell, but you replaced girl by a scene in which there's a thing, a young female thing. Then you take the next step, which is fell. There's the result of your first step, and there's the word fell, F-E-L, for L, and it's a person going on a downward path, and you ask it to do this step, and the result of that is you've eliminated the fell sound. The only sound you've got now left is who, but here there is the girl, and here there is fell. So you step again, and that is the word for who. It's a rather complicated one. It's got a couple of links here. It says something who something did some action. Then it combines, the curvy links combine the actions. So that's the word who, and that is the result of the second step of unification. And you ask it to do the third step, and you get a final meaning, which is a person who is falling. So that is quickly how the demonstration does language understanding. You can do the same thing for language generation. And finally, you can run it through an automatic learning sequence where it can start with no language, no words at all, and it builds up knowledge of first nouns and then the other parts of speech in the language. Okay.
How does it parse those first nouns, or is that based on entity recognition?
Well, let me go to that. Let's try and do that. Auto learn. I want to do a word. Sometimes since I used this, actually, we take a noun, apple. There's the construction it has to learn. Apple. Now, I think we're unscripted here, so it may go wrong. I can't learn that word. That's a pity. The learn button doesn't seem to show, doesn't seem to be activated at the moment. So what I can do is auto learn. So it uses a bunch of words to generate some random learning examples. And there are nouns, and there are adjectives and verbs, and there are some verbs there and some more verbs here. And I think when I press this button again, so what it does is it goes through random learning examples. Example 1 is hot apple. Example 0 is Anna ran. She saw, Tim saw, hot apple, my green apple fell. So what's happening is that it's producing the meanings for this. The child is observing the meanings and doing this intersection operation. And the child, one example is hot apple, my green apple fell. So the child collects a number of learning examples, including the word apple, and does the intersection operation. And each time the child observes the meaning going on, which is my green apple or apple fell or whatever it may be, and observes the sound, apple. So when the child does the intersection, it projects out the sound, apple, and it projects out the meaning, the round edible thing. And so the child learns the word for apple. So I'm sorry I couldn't demonstrate that in more detail, but perhaps if you go and experiment with the demonstration, you'll find out how to show more detail there.
Okay, so there's a juxtaposition and an associative learning at the phonemic and the conceptual level, and those get unified into what you're calling a script.
Yeah. And the script is always the top node of a construction, of any feature structure.
Okay, and the scripts are also composable in that trains of phonemes can be recursively parsed for their their lexical elements, and then that gets parsed in a way that is not exactly the Chomskyan sentence diagram, but more like a cognitive ontology about the causal relationships reflected by verbs and other parts of speech.
Yeah, it's built on animal cognition, where animals can recognize a scene and recognize what's doing what. And that non-verbal parsing is the way you build up the meaning part of sentences. If I just have a slight I saw him, for instance. So that meaning structure, there's the sound structure and there's the meaning structure. And the meaning structure is a sort of pre-existing animal cognition. Animals can parse scenes into structures like that. We've added the sounds.
What are the scenes? They also seem to be composable, and there's active and inactive scenes.
Yeah, that's right. The scenes with just things in them. There are scenes with action going on. Yeah.
So the lower scene, where act is false, is because it's just the fragment him.
Yeah, the lower scene is just describing him.
And then the composed scene is saw him, which is an action because it has a verb.
It's action of seeing, and it's time in the past tense. I mean, this particular diagram notation is in some sense not very important, because you could have other ways of parsing the world into scenes. You could have carved the world apart in slightly different ways. The same principles would hold. You still get feature structures, and you still have unification as a way of combining them.
So there's one kind of almost introspective optimization about pattern matching a new stimulus to previously recognized stimulus and doing a kind of detection, whether it fits exactly to what you've seen before, or making some kind of thresholding decision, like whether you're willing to accept a fuzzy match or going to generate a new template. But how do you connect that kind of knowledge optimization with the reduction of uncertainty about the ecological semantics, like the uncertainty distribution of who was it that saw him, or what is it that they did with him? How do you represent those uncertainties or questions, which the semantics of these diagrams end up providing information on?
Well, I think the semantics of these diagrams it comes from animal cognition, and animals have an ability to parse a scene into things and actions and recognize the importance of those things and actions. Animals see a predator or see something approaching, it's parsed the scene into predator and movement and so on and so forth. So all that is built on animal cognition and is not new for language. What's new for language is we pair that in arbitrary ways with sounds, and we build those bigger feature structures that have a sound part as well as a meaning part. But the whole animal thing is animal priors, and animal evolution has made animals categorize the world into those categories. And we have a huge number of categories that we carve the world apart into before language.
Do you think this helps? How do you feel that this advances or helps give a new perspective or direction for linguistics, which already has many ontologically structured sentence diagramming approaches and work at the morpho syntax interface with like how phonemes get associated to terminology?
Well, I don't think this is new. In other words, all the work on linguistics, people like Jack and Doff who've done work on lexical semantics, or many people have worked on it. And there's a whole consensus of all the work they've done. Langacker and cognitive linguistics started in the 80s. And this is just pulling that together in a working computational model. And I mean, I'll tell you the new parts of this first live stream are not the language production and language understanding. That has been going on for years in cognitive linguistics. The new parts are the language learning part is new, and the Bayesian interpretation linked to the FEP, that is new.
So just summarize again. How would you connect this or numerically to the FEP? How do we go from this structural qualitative map to quantitative information dynamics?
Well, that goes back to the slide. But if you build an FEP model of animal cognition, which is visual cognition, surveying a scene, classifying things into features and objects, and the whole of that top-down model, and you link that to language, the meaning part is conventional FEP. I get back to where, in other words, this diagram here it's loads of FEP papers about this, and that is the semantics side of language. What's new is linking it to the word sound, the word phonetics. And that's been going on in cognitive linguistics. It's kind of not new. It's been going on for so long, since the 1980s. That's what cognitive linguistics has been done. It started before the FEP, and the two have converged, if you like, that they can be seen as basically doing the same thing in the domain of language.
Yeah, there's an initial ingress unification processing from either visual edge detection in the case of reading or phonemes in the case of listening that move into a possibly very well behaved composable cognitive space that is what we tend to see in these hierarchical generative models, like whether it's the renormalization group type models or just other nested models or coarse grainings.
And any multi-scale.
Yeah, multi-scale. And then part of the challenge is in the situation where nested models represent spatial or temporal enclosure, you're dealing with a divisible concept of space. So the clustering from centimeter to meter is similar to the nesting of meter to kilometer. However, so that tree only has like one kind of branch if this were a nested spatial model. But when we are
it also has the branch that the spatial model comes up to classify things like insects or animals or vegetables or whatever. And so it's that classification into discrete things where the contact with language occurs.
Right. Language presents itself with many more kinds of edges, not just the lumping and splitting of a homogeneous field into different units of resolution, but it actually is the question of where and how the specificity and the semantics of different objects get reflected either in the biological substrate or in a computational substrate. So I'm just looking at, this gray pen. It's not immediately obvious, or there's multiple implementation strategies, how there could be, just to kind of give two options, there could be a color node where the value of the color belief is gray, or there could be a grayness or there could be a grayness node where the belief quantitatively is like yes.
Yeah, that's the kind of representational ambiguity. We don't know the detail of how colors are represented in language or in minds before language. But language has evolved to do the things that people find useful. In other words, if we live in a community where it's worth having shades of grey, we will develop words for shades of grey, and children will learn the words for shades of grey. If we live in a community where the only contrast we need is dark grey versus light grey, then we will develop words for those, and children will learn the words for those, and it'll be a different structure that gets learned.
Yes, and then there's the sort of a the natural history and the systems engineer path, whereas the natural history can do different gain, loss, change of functions to explore in that Marian or the Tinbergen framework what kinds of architectures are embodied by biological systems. How do they represent space? How do they represent color? What are their constraints on different kinds of beliefs and updating? Whereas there's a bit different and freer of a hand in the systems design, because even as we're just discussing, that there's a plurality of ways to represent even basic declarative semantics.
Yeah.
And so you can have heuristics.
Yeah, there's a whole story here that I haven't gone into at all. That is that word constructions evolve over human generations by there's a natural selection process for words. In other words, if a word is making a useful distinction, if the word pen is useful in our society, then that construction survives as it replicates through generations. If the word quill is no longer useful, then it goes extinct. So that natural selection process is superimposed on real natural selection and happens much faster. And that's the way languages change, that constructions evolve by a very fast selection process.
Yeah, to that, and I think on the learning and evolutionary, so within and across generational constraints, there's an analog of drift selection mutation balance where you could have one linguistic environment where there's a flat distribution, you have drifts, and you just have terms just change, nouns change, and things swap out. And then in the other extreme would be a heavily selected linguistic environment where there's more of a like truncating selection on incorrect language.
I believe we're more at the heavily selective. For linguistics, we're more at the heavily selective end. In other words, there are strong selection pressures on words and all sorts of selection pressures. Useful meanings, simple parsing, lack of ambiguity, and so on. So words come and word species come into being and get extinct very rapidly within 10 generations or something like that.
Yep, agreed. And also that even the generational change we observe is built on embodied causal substrate that's older than the mammalian. I'm really curious about what you said in the beginning about the shadow audience as our human sense of self. So how would you relate that to theory of mind, thinking through other minds, and what does that mean, that there's a shadow audience?
This is the part that interests me most, I guess, and it is for the next live stream, but I'll give you a flavor of it. When we're talking to someone in any conversation, we have to reply appropriately to what a conversational partner is saying. We have to work out what their intention is. So when I ask you a question, I am assuming that you will know that I need to know the answer. So that's the theory of mind. I ask a question, I immediately infer that you know I want an answer. And that's a typical piece of theory of mind. But because language is about social status, I'm thinking not only about what you think about this conversation, I'm thinking, what do you think about my social status? Do you think I'm being impolite? Do you think I'm being insincere or whatever? And so that's what goes on in conversation with you. You are the real audience. I use my theory of mind, which is Bayesian pattern matching, to infer what I think you are thinking right now. So that's when I'm speaking to you live. When I'm offline thinking myself, I'm imagining, what am I going to say to Dan this afternoon? Then I imagine you, and I imagine what I say, and I imagine your reaction to it. Dan will be offended. Dan will think I'm stupid or something like that. So there you are, my shadow audience. In my mind, I've conjured up a shadow audience, and I think, what's that shadow audience going to think of me? So that's the origin of my sense of myself, is what I think other people are going to think about me. So that shadow audience was born in conversation. You know, it evolved in conversation because I have to carry on conversations with people. And I need to rehearse those conversations in private thought. So when I rehearse any conversation, I have a shadow audience, and I imagine, what are people going to think of me if I say that? So that's all for what the next talk is about.
Yeah, that's quite a line. Like, how will I be seen or understood? But then who am I?
Yeah. And I believe that the human sense of self, which is much more developed than chimpanzees have a certain sense of self. They can see themselves in a mirror, but monkeys can't even recognize themselves in a mirror. I think most animals just don't have a self in that human sense. And the human sense of self was born with language. And it keeps society functioning together. I mean, that's why society works, because we're all thinking about what other people are going to think of us.
And that doesn't necessarily need to entail an individual level emulation, like explicit counterfactual theory of mind. It can also get, I don't know about sublimated or sedimented into just heuristics for how we engage with groups.
I think it's not so much heuristic. It's always quick subconscious pattern matching. If I say that, he will think this. And it's not a thought I have. It's something that happens before I say it and stops me saying it. So it's very quick and it's learned and it's sometimes wrong, you know. I think people who admire it I think if I buy a Ferrari, people will admire me. Now that thought is actually wrong, but it leads a lot of people to buy Ferraris.
Yeah, and from this belief updated hierarchical generative model, it is possible to, you can imagine a variety of other mental operations. Like you can sample phonemes or sentences from lower down in the tree that are consistent with the upper part. You could imagine varieties of counterfactuals of how things could be differently. You could combine this with a action model, with a causal world model that could connect to those counterfactuals, and then we would basically be in the setting of calculating the expected free energy and assessing different courses of action in terms of their epistemic and pragmatic value.
Yeah, I mean, these things all filtering up and down the hierarchy, basically from the phonemes of what somebody says to you to the top of your hierarchy of the self-esteem, my position in society. And they're all linked in one big pre-conscious inference. This pattern matching is going on the whole time, and it's subconscious, basically.
Well, you have consciousness here at the 3D generative model layer, but
yeah,
of course,
there's a lot of consciousness around, but the actual understanding a sentence, you're doing unifications about 5 per second, and that's too fast for conscious thought. And so you're also having ego reactions at 2 or 3 per second. You're having ego reactions faster than conscious thought. It's all quick Bayesian pattern matching. So it's a big picture.
Yeah, I am still left with that pattern matching is just this internal kind of library science, almost like there's a request coming in and there's going to be some internal process to match and either accept a stringent or a fuzzy match or make a new entry. However, there's a second level semantics, which is the reduction of uncertainty, minimization of surprise, regarding the message of that request.
Yeah, does that message fit into the context right now? That's the top-down fitting. Top-down and bottom-up's happening all the time.
So, what will we look forward to in 2 weeks?
Basically, it's how language evolved, why language evolved, and language, as I say, language evolved by sexual selection to show off intelligence and get mates. That's basically it. So because it's showing off intelligence, it's all about social status in the group, and the theory of mind part of language, carrying on conversation, is all about self-esteem. And basically, pragmatics, how we carry on conversations, has been, if you like, the poor relative of linguistics. everybody's studied syntax and semantics, and they have nice systems, but pragmatics has been very much less developed since about 1980. And in particular, people studying pragmatics don't look at both sides of the problem. They haven't looked at the speaker's problem as much as the listener's problem. Pragmatics has been all about what do listeners do to understand in the context what the person is saying. And it's not been about what the speaker does to get himself understood in a conversation. So the next lecture is largely about pragmatics and evolution. Then it leads on to the human sense of self and human nature.
Very cool. Anything else you want to say or ask
No,
on this
no.
one? I think it's an awesome unification work, and I out of the corner of my eye see the kinds of graph technology developments that would help us make these types of agentic or orchestrated knowledge graphs that have elements of linguistic semantics and quantitative graphical models. And those methods to be able to do assembly and parsing of those more rapidly to support some of these. I'll read one question from the live chat, Robert. So, Mills8102 wrote, I'm thinking about how we have different modes for different environments, home, workplace, recreation, etc. I wonder what the effects are of maintaining more or less of these modes on someone's adaptability.
In the context of language, I think that's absolutely right. We do have different personalities and different ways of presenting ourselves linguistically in different environments. We have, if you like, a different vocabulary for work versus home versus sport or whatever it may be. And so that is one dimension that when we go to a different environment, we switch in a different set of priors about what words we're likely to hear and what people are likely to mean by them.
Okay. Hope people
Can I
enjoyed.
just end with one appeal? I think end with an appeal that language, I think, is a hugely productive area for the FEP. And I would very much like to be involved in any FEP implementation of language along the lines I've sketched, and to try and take it right down to the level of neural implementation. That I think is a hugely promising and challenging research project. And I'd welcome anybody who wants us to collaborate on it, knows more about FEP than I do.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert. Till next time.
See you then.
See you.
Okay.